Good morning, Bowerbirders.
Hi, everyone.
We don't do that anymore. We don't do hello Bowerbirders as much as we used to.
Yeah, hello, Bowerbirders. This is Nic
and Ben coming to you live from
Zoom,
the internet. Yeah, well, it's a little bit. It's a step above Zoom, isn't it? Let's face it.
Hey, this should be a good conversation today because we're talking about writing with AI. And so it means all the hate mail can be directed directly towards Ben Morgan at Bowerbird. I'm off the hook today.
That's really my email.
Yeah. So we've posted a few things on LinkedIn. It's awards season. So there are lots of awards. There's the Institute of Architects Awards in Australia, Architizer Awards, Frame Awards. I just saw Caitlin Butler post something for awards on LinkedIn just then, which must be... I'm just wondering, for Architecture AU is posting for awards as well.
Design Awards open in February, I think, or thereabouts.
So there's a lot of people out there who are getting projects photographed and then they're going to be writing descriptions. And we thought this was a really good opportunity to rethink how we write descriptions because we think it's changing. We think it's a little bit different to how you would have used to have written a project description. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in the old days, I think, you posed this question of how would you advise people to create an awards entry? I think back in the early days, I would say, oh, look, if you really struggle with it, go and find an expert who can do that. And, I used to be one of those experts, as in I am a trained writer. And nowadays,
Hey Ben, imagine you're a journalist.
I'll imagine I'm a journalist. If you imagine you're what are you now? I don't know what.
I don't know. Sorry, this is an inside joke.
If you can imagine you're a CEO.
This is an inside joke. Whenever I'm talking to Ben, I say, imagine you're a journalist. And he goes, well, I am.
And I am a journalist. So that used to be the advice, really, was if you're not very good at writing, go and find someone who is good at writing and hire them to do it for you. Still relevant for some people. Again, you don't want to spend too much of your time doing something that you hate doing. Let's change a little bit. It's not that you're not good at it or that you can't be good at it. If you just hate writing, by all means, go and hire someone to do it. But AI has changed the whole landscape of writing for us and for everyone, I think.
I think we would have used brief challenges and solutions as a framework for writing. So whenever somebody said, how do I write a project description? And we're trying to get away from archi-speak. So, everyone should know what archi-speak is. It's that gibberish that architects put together with all these very large words, and they don't actually mean anything. And so journalists hate this, by the way. So we talk to a lot of journalists. Their whole profession is around words, and you're sending them horrible words. So that's typically a bad thing to be doing. And I mean, we used to have a archi-speak channel, actually, because we used to collect these from all over the world just for internal laughs and giggles. But it's amazing how you can use a lot of words and it doesn't actually tell your true story. And every building has this story. So we would use brief challenges and solutions as a framework to try to help people craft that story without getting sidetracked into all the jargon.
Was using a basic structure of beginning, middle, and end, essentially. And I think what it was that it was the architects were sort of in a lot of ways trained to talk about the end, talk about the solution. So they were very good at sort of looking at a beautiful facade or talking about the final solution, that roof line, the stuff that they spent all of their time working on, and kind of forgot to talk about the client, which is where the brief is, and the challenges, which are the things you kind of want to forget about, like planning restrictions, having to change the builder halfway through the project. But, those things that make an amazing episode of Grand Designs, but most architects want to forget forever.
Yeah, and it was about centering the story around the reader, whereas architects center the story around what was most painful to them. So you often see the architect is focused on a detail which isn't really part of the overall narrative, but it was a really hard part. So things like there was a weird shelf which they went back and forth on for 2 years with the client, and finally they got this shelf. But from the outside, that shelf isn't really the story. The story is probably something to do with the clients, because if that's the audience that you're trying to attract, you want to let them see themselves as the hero, that you want them to be the character who's going on this journey. And again, the story we always used to tell was Lord of the Rings. So you imagine Frodo, and Frodo is given this mission, has this ring, has to go fight all the dragons, which are probably town planners, and then eventually gets to the volcano, dumps the ring in the volcano, and yay, everybody celebrates. And that more or less works quite well, but you end up with a lot of, I guess it's still a template way of writing a description. And I think AI is switching that up a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason I used to say go and find an expert is that expert it wasn't so much about writing the story. It wasn't the writing of it. It was the interviewing you. It was the getting the story, finding the story. And in a lot of ways, AI can do that really well now. It can do the interviewing, the journalistic side of things kind of better than I ever could. I'm allowed to say that because I don't practice as a journalist anymore. I'm not trying to convince anyone to to use my services. But absolutely, like if you go onto even just ChatGPT and say, interview me about this project, it does a really good job at extracting that information from you.
Yeah, maybe what was happening when you hire somebody else, you were separating yourself from the project, because it's quite hard to write about the thing that you've worked on because you're too close to it and your ego is tied up in it. So by getting a writer, they could come and ask you questions externally, which are probably going to be interesting to somebody who has no idea what the project is. And that's part of where AI, I think, is coming in. Like you were mentioning, you can get AI to interview you now, and it's going to ask you questions and pull out a really good story. So the actual writing, like that structure that we were talking about, brief challenges and solutions, that's really the end process. It's not really the start of how you write a description anymore. It should really be around the research phase.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's those things that I like as a practicing journalist, the questions I really want to get to. And again, a journalist is looking for a story. It may not, like a project could have 100 stories that are appropriate for 100 different publications. But, when I was writing for Dwell magazine in the US, there would be a brief that came to me through the commissioning editor. We want you to write about this. There's a real focus in this issue on color. And so I'm going to have something that I'm aiming to get out of that, but I'm looking for a story. So the story has to relate to color, but then beyond that, it's like, what is the story? There's so many different ways to tell that story. And I think AI is kind of we're at this point where you can try and tell all the stories. Like, it's not that hard. If AI is just popping up and saying, answer this question, and you answer the question honestly, then it's able to get that and make that part of the story. I just think it's so much easier now. And I think we probably need to address the elephant in the room, which is that people mostly are afraid of AI. And if all you're saying is AI, then yeah, there's lots of things to be scared about within AI. It's a very broad term. It's not even particularly well defined, right?
Well, we often talk about AI actually is really amplified intelligence, not artificial intelligence at this point. So you still have to have skills to be able to use it. So let's say you're a graphic designer and you ask ChatGPT to create an image. You still have to have the good sense to know if that image that's returned is good or not. And the same thing happens with writing. It's not always going to be perfect, but if you have some level of skills, you're going to be able to see when it succeeds, and it often succeeds at a higher rate than you could do it yourself. That's what I notice. And my writing level would be lower than yours. So for me, I find it as a natural jump.
No.
Yeah, I can't even spell.
I taught Nick about hyphens. I'm sure every time you see something with a hyphen, you think of me.
Yeah, I do think about hyphens. Something that we may want to go back to, just to go through a little bit of the history of how publications changed. We had probably desktop publishing around 85. You see the advent of print magazines. So they flourish. They tend to be national at that stage. We don't really have international media coverage at a large extent. And then somewhere around the 2000s, we start to see all these websites come out. And that's where media becomes international. We've got email, we've got digital photos, things start to be transferred, but the speed at which articles were being written increases. And so what's happening is the Arc Dailies of the world, they need more content, and the cost to get that content has to drop. So rather than having a magazine every 3 months with 10 stories, you have 10 stories every single day. And what that led to is what we might call the copy and paste era. And that's where you started to see architects write, the architect statement. And this one statement would be replicated again and again and again and again. And that was just the economics of that medium. And AI is starting to shift that, I think. I think we're going to see a move towards custom content because AI allows you to write custom stories very, very quickly, with the caveat, if you have the source information. Which,
but that to me is that's the key to AI. So let's maybe we just sort of need to find a different way of talking about AI because it is such a broad topic. So I guess what we're talking about is data extraction from humans. So humans, if they're the ones with the data points, or let's say the data points are all over the place. They're in spreadsheets. They're in
the stories in your head.
Yep, the stories in your head, but it's also in the client's head, and it's also in the builder's head, and it's all over. All of this data is disparate. And the problem that a lot of AI has, like if you go to ChatGPT and say, I've just completed this house and I want you to write a story about it, and you don't give it any information, how is it going to know anything? It's going to make it all up. It's going to hallucinate, right? And I think a lot of people sort of do that and go, oh, this thing's made it all up. It's not reliable. What AI can do is that it can help in the extraction of that data, of that information. So you can upload a spreadsheet, you can upload a floor plan, you can send it off to interview the builder, for example. That sort of stuff, all of a sudden you're getting way more information than any one article could possibly cover. So I think there's that interviewing rather than just going AI. It's like now we can create a lot more interviews and find more data.
Well, you can see it in how Bower kits have evolved. So this is what we do day to day is we're trying to figure out how we improve Bowerbird. And the big aspect is using AI to prompt questions because AI can see what's in the images. They automatically know what your thing is about. And with a little bit of information, it can start to create questions. And as somebody answers those questions, AI can loop and ask more questions. And so you're digging into all of these aspects of a story. And then when you add on top of that, the ability to go and interview somebody. So now, let's say you credit somebody on a Bower kit and it says, hey, you should credit the heritage consultant because this building involves this historical building and the new renovation. There's a person to interview there. The problem is previously having a journalist go and interview each of those individuals and then create a transcript and then try to digest that transcript and turn it into a story, which then ends up just being a generic copy and paste description. The value wasn't really stacking up.
Well, and I got to say, transcribing interviews was the biggest pet peeve for me. But it was also, it was interesting because it was also when I listened back to that recording that I found the story. So if I didn't used to send my recordings off to be transcribed because actually listening back to it was part of the story writing process for me. But again, AI kind of does a lot of that stuff for you now. It's listening to the transcript and coming up with these things, and it frees me up or the writer up to think more about the narrative and how they're going to piece things together and what they want to focus on. So it's a lot more like having an assistant, a writing assistant, than someone to sort of do it all for you.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of that approach is now you can start to answer questions which appeal to far more people. Not as in a mainstream story, but you think about a niche story. So if you have a hospital or a school or a cafe, there's all these publications out there which would like to cover your story, but because you haven't answered a question specific to their niche, they can't really address it. So now basically doing this research up front, you're opening yourself up to far more opportunities to have custom stories written about your work. The other aspect of this, so we've got on one side, we can do a lot more research, and let's vaguely say the package of content that you create around a project has drastically increased, and it's much larger now than a single journalist wants to read through. Like that journalist can't absorb it all. So what's happening is we now plug that into something like AI Writer to be able to distill that into something that's usable and customize based on whatever that journalist is trying to do. So that's why journalism is changing. It's because you've got far more source content. Then you've got the ability to very quickly create custom stories. So this idea of copy and paste now, to me, it doesn't make sense. You're really just going to get flagged by Google for duplicate content, and you're not really going to be addressing the custom audience of whoever you're trying to submit to, whether that's an awards program or a publication.
Yeah. I think, again, I think the fear of AI is probably driving a lot of people's opinions around how it's using and how it's being used. And I think I heard the analogy the other day that AI is kind of a bit more like the invention of the internet, in that it's not a platform. It's not something like, the Apple Store or anything like that. It's not a piece of technology like the iPhone, but it is really transformative. And I think if you think about it like that, you go, well, the early days of the internet, there were websites, and what were they? So someone invented someone invented an animated GIF, right? And that's what the internet was. And I think if you looked at it back in those days and went, would I invest billions of dollars into a flashing website? Most people would have been like, no. And I think we're kind of at that same point with AI as well. Rather than thinking about it just as ChatGPT, rather than thinking about it as robots taking over the world, think about it as, hang on, this is a new internet where people are gonna take those building blocks and build some unbelievable and amazing things. And I think that's once you get to that point and apply that to storytelling, it's freeing up the ability to tell more stories and tell better stories.
Yeah, and I think they call it a horizontal technology. So it's going to go across everything. It's a bit like a database. We forget that a database completely changed how the world worked, changed how buildings work too. There used to be reinforced multi-story buildings just to store files because of the weight of all those documents. That's all now in a database, this magical thing that you could search. You could just find this information. I think it's a similar line to that. The interesting thing with the AI at the moment is we've got language models. All of this stuff has been trained on language, and it's been trained on the best writers in the world. That's why
they've trained it on me. I didn't realize.
No, they've got an exclusion there. They just
please exclude
train it on all writers except for Ben Morgan.
Yeah, fair enough.
Or Nick Granlees, with exception for hyphens. So it's exceptionally good at that. It's interesting. So Wade Smith from Co-Architecture was just commenting on how I wouldn't trust the text that's coming out, and especially in relation to SEO. I would be very surprised if AI can't do a good job of that, but it's dependent on two things, which is the input information that you put into it and the prompt that you use. And essentially, if you use a generic prompt, don't be surprised if you get a generic output. Also, don't be surprised if you're not feeding it your own information. Don't be surprised if all it's doing is just sending you a wrapper, essentially, a story that's waiting for you to add the facts to actually make it your own.
Yeah, like all the joining words with none of the facts.
Yeah. Because one way is, like, the way I think about writing, and this is how the media kit started off on Bowerbird, is I went through a block of text with a highlighter and to highlight the facts, and then turned those into questions and said, well, this is what a journalist is writing. Here's the actual information they need. Everything else is a wrapper which frames the story. It tells a narrative, and it can be the difference between an enjoyable piece of text to read and an ugly piece of text to read.
A dot point list.
The dot point list. But that's what AI is really good at, is the wrapper now. But the trick is with the prompts is to give it some direction. So if you have a way that you want to tell a story, or if you have a tone of how you want to tell the story, or if you want to focus on something, you work on the prompt and you refine that prompt. And eventually you have this way of press a button and you get a first draft of anything that you want to write.
Well, I think first draft is a really interesting way to look at it as well, because you don't, if all you're doing is saying, okay, we're going to create an AI tool that just spits out some information and then we're just going to trust that 100%, right? Again, as you say, if the input's bad, then the output's going to be bad. That's not AI's fault. That's your fault for
rubbish in, rubbish out.
Exactly. I think that there's this sense of, okay, well, don't trust AI to do everything. And it's like, well, that's kind of really obvious. Like, you can trust it to do really specific things now. Like, AI has gotten to the point where it will be 100% accurate on certain, data requests and things like that. When it comes to storytelling, if you just go on, the first thing you do is go to ChatGPT and say, you could just say, interview me about my project. Like literally that could be the sentence. That's a terrible prompt because it doesn't know anything. What do you mean project? It doesn't know who you are. But it might come back and say, what sort of project is this? And you go, well, it's a house in Melbourne. And it goes, okay, cool. That sounds interesting. Like because of the language model, and it has that built-in curiosity as well, because you've asked it to interview you. And so it knows that it needs to keep asking questions. It will never stop, to be fair. It'll never stop. But, once you go through a few of those and then change the prompt to write an article or write a description that's 300 words long for the answer to this question in an awards entry, it's going to give you, at the very least, it's going to give you a fantastic first draft. You can then go and iterate using AI, or you can take that away and go, great, I'm no longer starting with a blank sheet of paper, a blank Word doc, or a blank description field on a website.
Yeah, a simple technique for doing this is doing exactly that, asking yourself, what is this project? And then asking yourself a follow-up question. And as you add more information, you ask a follow-up question. So you just credited this engineer. What did the engineer do? And then you probably get stuck at some point where you go, I need to go talk to the engineer to know their story. But in theory,
which you can now do on Bowerbird using our AI interview tool.
Wow. But it's true. Like you do that and you go within about half an hour, you can, like on a Bower kit now, you can run through and fire off a lot of interviews. And suddenly you have niche stories which were never told. Like I often think about the number of stories that have gone to the grave with people who were never asked what they did. Like you think about something like the Opera House in Sydney. There were so many people who worked on that. And there's probably books and books all about the architect, but it's missing hundreds of stories of what went into building that. That's why I think there's going to be a dispersion of stories, because we're going to be able to involve more people in telling their perspective of how they are involved and then digest all of that. And so the other prediction, it's terrible to make predictions because who knows what's actually going to happen.
It's fun though.
Yeah. But I suspect we're going to end up with more publications. I think we're already seeing this. Like another call out to Andrew Chong, who's creating a new publication every.
And it also I think what's really interesting about Andrew is that he is an architect by trade and has started moving into the publishing world. So that's why we love talking to him, because he's kind of had a similar trajectory to you and to me as well, where it's kind of trying to figure stuff out, figure the internet out, just build stuff, iterating. So a little bit of background on Andrew and why we might mention him.
Yeah, so the prediction is we're going to see far more niche publications. Probably we're going to see the efficiency of running a publication, it becomes more efficient because you've got AI, you've got access to more information, you've got the ability to write stories in a faster way, and I think you're going to see an increase in quality. I think it's going to be the opposite of what people fear, which is here's a heap of junky AI stories. They're going to be outcompeted very quickly if you've got access to new information. And that's why interviewing yourself is so valuable, because you have information that has never been on the internet. AI doesn't know about your thing. That's what makes it relevant to journalists. So the more of that you can unlock, the more opportunities you have.
And that goes back to sort of Wade's comment. I think Wade from Co-Architecture was saying in his comment that, SEO is really important, and Google will essentially be able to tell that something is that something's AI. That may not have been exactly what he said. Sorry for paraphrasing, but that Google's looking for specific things. And I think what's interesting, actually, I'm just going to see if I can pull it up here. Oh yeah, so it was Google prioritizes EEAT, which is experience, expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. And I think what's really interesting about those things, and we've always said this about SEO, is architects naturally feed into, and publications like ArcDaily naturally feed into exactly what Google wants. You are giving experience, expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness directly to Google, and it's relevant as well. I think that's the important thing. It's relevant. So when someone's searching for an architect, and then it shows up on ArcDaily as the top result for that architect, it's because Arc Daily talks only about architecture and it's all totally relevant. So I think that idea of, because I think we sort of talked about this in the early days of AI, that you might end up with AI publications that are just AI. And I'm sure they're out there in all sorts of different industries. Architecture is probably the last one that will have one. But yes, you can have that. AI is just generating content. It's sort of consuming other content and reshaping it and rewriting it. Those are not the things that people generally respond to. So again, it's trying to hack SEO. It's trying to go, oh, Google, rank this higher. What we're talking about here is really the better stories, improving the quality of content. And again, that comes from extracting the expertise, extracting the experience, extracting the authority, and extracting the trustworthiness from any number of different people, not just architects.
Well, a good story comes from good research. And, something we see, because we've got tens of thousands of Bower kits running through the system now. So we see what people write, and we can also see who gets published. So we can see that people can often write one paragraph and think that's the story of their project, but there's no story in it. Again, when you highlight what is the unique facts of this paragraph, it's a residential house in Melbourne designed by an architect. There's no human story there. But as soon as you get into what the client is actually trying to achieve, like I was just pulling up one here. I saw this one this morning. I think it's the Linwood therapy pool. I don't know if you've seen that one pop up.
Literally the one that I clicked on. I was gonna do a little, maybe we can just screen share and do this. Yeah, literally the one I clicked on as well. Yep.
Which is because it's got this really cool photo as well of somebody in a pool with an arched window. But what's interesting when you go through their story is, I might just read this out. OEB Architects was approached to design a therapy pool for a client affected by chronic back pain, which had left them unable to move or rest comfortably, let alone walk down the steep steps to the pebble beach for their unusual swim in the sea. Usual swim in the sea. But they've already framed the story really well. They've told you about the client. They've told you what the problem is. Like, straight up, really, really well done. And then they can start, second paragraph, the site lies within a terraced front garden of a Victorian villa. Again, all of that's facts. It's quite dense in what they're actually describing here. Then we were interested in how to make a building that felt both at home. So it's giving the architect's perspective. That's good. And then it's going through the choices they were making. So rather than using the stone and mosaic of historical examples, we used timber frame, insulation board. And so it goes on. So now you've gone through a journey of the choices they've made. And there's a couple extra paragraphs. The relief of the elevations is formed in a variety of depths of insulation. That's probably a little bit archy speak, the relief of the elevations, but that's okay. But they're sort of going through the design of the project. And often in an architectural story, it's the photos which are the success of the story. It's already obvious what you did in the end. But that's just an example. I think that's actually quite a nice story of how you would lead in.
Well, I'm actually really interested about this one to see whether they wrote it themselves or with assistance from AI.
Yes.
Tempted to reach out to Tessa and sort of say, hey, really curious about your process of writing this. So, because that to me, I look at that and I go, that's the quality of story that we're now getting through the AI writing tools. Where previously you would have gotten, like if you go on, actually have a look on their website, it doesn't have the emotive thing of the client story and all of that. So their website description is different to ultimately what they've prepared for the media. I think that's really fascinating. I think I'll reach out to Tessa after this and see if they did use AI or what their process was for creating that text, because I agree that's very well written.
So I guess we come back to the awards because, we've sort of titled this video all around how to write an awards description because that's what everyone is doing. Part of that is because the content you create for awards and the content you create for media overlaps. It's very similar.
Yeah, I think it's the building block information of the story.
Yeah, the research. So what we're suggesting here is if you're doing your awards, spend more time on the research phase and then allow ChatGPT or AI writer on Bowerbird to actually give you a first draft, maybe work a little bit on the prompt. If you don't know how to write, just go to AI and say, could you please tell me a writing structure for this type of content? Then give that as the prompt And so it's really not that hard to do.
Well, actually, that's before we move on, that's a fantastic thing that AI is really good at, creating prompts for itself. So if you don't know how to write an AI prompt, go to ChatGPT and say, I need to write a prompt, and it'll either ask you more questions or it'll just go, great, here's a really useful prompt. And that's actually what AI is doing now. It's creating its own prompts to kind of train itself as well, just as an aside.
Yeah. And now, to be fair, your photos are going to lead your project. They always do. That's the initial emotion that you get. But the text is what allows people to dig into your story and actually attach themselves with, I guess, a longer time span. We just got off a phone call with Daniel Moore from the Vic chapter of the Australian Institute of Architects, which was interesting, talking about their awards program because they have site visits, which is a little bit different. So
yeah, I think the entries are assessed and then shortlisted, and all of the shortlisted projects are visited in person by the juries.
Yeah, that's right. But what's interesting is that you also have a presentation to juries somewhere in between there.
Yeah.
And what Daniel was saying is that being able to know your project before you have to talk about it is a similar process to writing about it. Because if you haven't gone through the work of interviewing yourself, when you're put on the spot to talk about it, you're going to struggle to be able to create the narrative. So in my mind, everything has been weighted towards that interview phase now. And then, at least for the writing, I think AI comes in and does a lot of the heavy lifting. And then even with the speaking on this, I would go and ask AI, can you give me some talking points on this project for a presentation to juries with the audience of architects? And it will probably highlight the things that you should practice.
I don't know whether they find out who the juries are beforehand, but I think AI would even be good at, if you put in the names and the websites of the jury members, I would be very surprised if it wasn't good at actually picking up on some of the stuff you might not even know about those jurors, and being able to craft the story, not like authentically, still making it authentic, but craft the way that you present to tailor it towards those jurors.
Yeah, and so that's another example of tailoring. So the AI is allowing you to focus on one audience, but you're doing it very quickly. So as long as you have somewhere where you have source material, so you are collecting this package of content around your project, and then you can tap into AI, the AI can write about that very accurately. I think that was always the concern. People were worried about how well AI, or how much it hallucinates.
Yeah. Makes
But
stuff up.
There's two ways to overcome that. One is you feed it really good source information. So the less information you feed it, the worse it will be. The second way is to use some sort of fact checker. So what we did is we built our own fact checking tool into AI Writer. That's just using AI again. And what it's doing is it's checking what AI wrote and making sure that it matches the source information. So you end up with these loops of how you can actually really improve the quality of what AI is writing about.
Well, I think the interesting thing about the awards, and we've spoken about this for years, pre-AI, or whatever, if that's a real thing, pre-AI, but before ChatGPT launched, we talked about this idea of knowing the story before you commission your photographer. So for awards entries, like if you're talking not about the institute here in Australia, but other awards programs, big ones like WAF and Design, my understanding is they don't do, so Design, for example, I think they just go off the entry, the submitted entry. I don't think there's any presentation to juries. Could be wrong. WAF, there is presentation to juries, but they don't do site visits because that would be incredibly expensive to go all around the world looking at all of those projects. And so all understandable. But what they all have in common is that the first port of call is the photos. And so if your photos don't match with the story that you want to tell, then you kind of failed. The only way you could change that is to go back and reshoot to get the image of the important parts of the story. So we've always said, figure out the story beforehand. And even if all you're doing is going to ChatGPT and saying, I need to brief my photographer on a project and I want to make sure I don't miss any important shots. I mean, I reckon ChatGPT would do a great job of helping you build the story beforehand.
This is where having somebody external, or even AI being that external source for you, asking questions is good, because as the architect, your memory is going to be shaped by the amount of pain that you went through when you were designing something, not the elements which are the best story. So if there was a part of a project that you overly focused on because you went back and forth with a client for 2 years, but when you finally get to the building, everybody else just goes, I didn't even notice that, or I don't care about that.
I think, again, my piece of advice that we've given for 10 years since we started this whole thing, because as a journalist, when you get commissioned to write a story on a project, yes, you talk to the architect, but you also talk to the client. And I would say the first port of call before you even interview yourself is interview your client. And when I say interview, you could ask them one question. You could say, what's your favorite thing about this project? How has this project changed the way you work, live, play, all of those things? If you go and ask those simple questions, apart from anything else, it's going to spark a conversation that'll probably, if you're actually talking to them, could take hours, because it's going to spark them off going, oh, and this is great. Oh, and I love this. And this is my favorite thing as well.
Well, it's that story from John Liu when photographing a project years ago, and he's given me a tour of the house and is telling me about all the parts they've designed and all these elements. And then the clients were there and their story was very different. It was all about this one step. And this was the step of the old house, which they used to sit on as a family. So it was emotionally very important to them. And so when they built the extension, they wanted to maintain what used to be a step to the outside. That, as soon as I heard it, I'm going, that's the story. Like, that's the emotion. Like, everybody can imagine this simple step. We all used to sit on it and we want to maintain that. That becomes the center of the house. That's why you go talk to the client, because they're going to not speak in archi speak. They're going to speak with emotion, and emotion is what's going to drive really good stories.
I love that too. Like, it could inform the name of the project. Like, I mean, the step house, there's probably 1,000 of those out there, so make sure you Google it. But the family step house, whatever you want to call it. And I think what's really interesting in that is sometimes it's just this little detail that got decided really early on, and it wasn't necessarily significant to the architect. But then you think about, what did we have to do to keep that step? So that initial conversation meant we're going to have a level change. And that's going to change a lot of things. That's going to change the roof line, potentially. It's going to change what rooms go above the step change and what rooms go below the step change. All of these things where all of a sudden, from that client perspective, you all of a sudden get this huge story, a much bigger story that's so much more interesting than what you were originally going to talk about.
Well, here's an interesting approach you could use with AI. Let's assume you've got your source information either on Bowerbird or somewhere else. Then actually ask the AI, what story titles, or how would you approach telling a story around this project? It's probably going to give you some ideas of how you might structure it. Then you choose one and ask it again, saying, can you write a story with a focus on this thing? If you're still not happy with it, just play with it a little bit and say, I want to write a story that focuses on the client and I want to involve emotion in the story. Those little tiny changes to the prompt will change the way it's thinking about structuring that whole narrative. You're just going to elevate the writing with one or two extra lines in a prompt.
I was thinking as well about ChatGPT in particular, but there's lots of tools like this where you ask it a question or you give it a prompt and it comes back and you go, I hate that answer, right? And especially in the early days, there were many times where I was just like getting angry with AI. No, you've got it wrong. And I think a really simple thing to avoid that is to go, once again, it's not AI's fault. I'm not giving it the right inputs. I'm not giving it the right data. So if you find that you go through this process, you get some text and you go, it's still terrible, you just haven't given it the things that it needs. And that might be, I know there's some tools out there that, not sure whether Notebook LM does it, but some of these other AI tools where you can actually train it on your voice. So if you have a whole heap, let's say you have a whole heap of academic writing that you're really proud of, right? You could go and put that in and say, this is my style of writing, and then write my awards entry based on this, but remove the archi speak. You might find in that process that it sounds a lot more like you, or that you feel more comfortable with it. You could feed in Facebook posts, anything that gives you that style that you want, and see if the AI can copy that.
I find AI is constantly giving me ideas of how to write things now. So I think that, again, the same trick is start off with your source material. And I often think that writing will become dot points. So the AI will do that better than I will, but I need to give it the ideas. Like, what am I thinking about and what am I trying to communicate? Can I put that into dot points? And then can I let the AI run? And I'm amazed by how it structures a language in a far more beautiful way than I ever could. But I
Well,
think the trick is,
that's unsurprising. You only just learn about hyphens. So
I think the trick is understanding the writing sources that you like. So if you know a publication that you think they write good articles, or if there's an author that you really like, or if there's a way of writing, you might ask AI, how does this author write in this way? Like, what are they doing here? And it's often quite good at that. And then you can use that writing structure inside your prompt. And suddenly this beautiful prose is coming out. It's structuring things quite well. You just grab the paragraphs. You might be missing a paragraph and say, I need you to write an extra paragraph on this dot point. And it does a brilliant job of that.
I think the major takeaway for me is that AI can write an entire article for you if you give a good source material and you're not too picky about it. It can be a great way to create an outline. So you can say, I'm writing, this is my task, this is what I'm writing, give me an outline. Basically, you can use it in so many different ways that mean you're not just starting off with a blank page. That is always what scares most people, right? Even journalists. If you said to a journalist, you're in a locked room, you need to write an article on a piece of paper, you need to write an article on XYZ, you'd freak out. Hang on, I need to do an interview. I need to go and talk to someone. Like, that's what a journalist will do. Okay, I need to talk to someone. I need to do some research here at some point, and I need to get new information. And AI can help you with all of that stuff. So it's either just an assistant to help you get past that, I really don't want to do this thing stage, or it's something that can genuinely do the whole. I've seen examples where it does the whole thing for us. Like, for me, it's done the whole thing for me, and I read over it and I go, that's perfect. So it can happen. You can get it to work really well. Again, good source material.
Well, and I think it's improving the instruction. Going back to what you said, one of the things that working with AI has taught me is that now I understand that giving instructions to our team, how ambiguous normal instructions are, because we're assuming all of these things are just implied. When you work with AI, you realize, I need to change this, and it forces you to improve how you're articulating what is it that you want me to do. So, for example, if you say, write me a good article, it's like, what does good mean? Be more specific. Are you talking about good in SEO? Are you talking about good in it makes me cry by the time I've finished reading it? Like, what is your purpose here? So once you go beyond those generic prompts, you start to get really good outputs from it.
I think an interesting analogy here is Google. And I think in the early days of Google, I don't know if you ever did this in class at school, but it was like you had to learn how to use Google. I feel like a lot of things now, like a lot of people just don't really understand that. And Google, obviously, it's now got the AI component as well. But back in the day, it would be like, well, if you want Google to return a specific phrase, you want to make sure, guarantee that there's a certain word is in the results. You do quote marks around it. Maybe a lot of people still don't know that. I'm not sure. But it was how you use the thing gets you the results that you want. And I think there's definitely a learning curve there for all of us. And I think it's that persevering and not being worried that, just not being afraid of it, not being worried that you're going to stuff something up or it's going to hallucinate and then you're going to lose your job. It's just, these things don't happen.
You see this debate within companies at the moment where some people are resisting using AI, whereas we're very much pro AI. We use it for everything. But the question in my head is, if somebody comes to you and says, I don't use AI, I would be going, why not? Why are you not using a tool that is amplifying your intelligence? You're doing the company a disservice by not using this or learning how to use it, because this is going to help you improve everything that you do. So obviously we're probably on that pro side of things where we think this is actually a really useful tool. But I think there's going to be a natural progression, because we've seen this as well. When AI first came out 2 years ago, everybody was freaking out. We're never going to write with this. This is wrong. I'm a writer. And now we say, we use it for story ideas. Well, we use it for, a first draft, but we're still crafting it. And I think that transition is just moving along until people feel more comfortable with the technology.
I think one of the most fascinating things is that when we speak to freelance writers and we talk to them about AI, they essentially just go, yeah, love it. Fantastic. I use it for everything. Like I use it every day. And then when you talk to someone who's at an established publication, who's an editor, they feel like they kind of need to say, no, we would never do that. We would never use AI. perhaps they are and just not telling us that they are. But I think that sort of reflects as AI as a tool, incredibly useful. And if you know how to use it, it's going to help you a lot. And then AI as a cultural phenomenon, as a change phenomenon, there's definitely a lot of resistance to it.
It's like, Ben, it's unethical to use spell checkers. Spell checkers. You should be able to spell by yourself. You shouldn't use a spell checker. That's just cheating.
I guarantee
real
you
journalism.
that's what was said when spell checkers first came out. This is going to create a generation of lazy spellers. And you know what? They were absolutely right, because you can be a lazy speller.
So
you've now got these tools that can make you sound good.
We're coming up to 48 minutes, so we might try to keep this one under the hour. Last time we went up to 2 hours.
That was our entire history, though, to be fair.
We missed out stories too, I realized afterwards, but we'll have many more stories to tell. I was just going to say, if anybody's following along, please comment on these videos or on LinkedIn. We're posting a lot more at the moment. It prompts us to have a conversation each week, and we'll try to unpack things, and
and tell us where we're wrong and how we're wrong, and we'll tell you the same.
Yeah. Very good. Cool. Okay, folks. Hope that helped a little bit. Maybe
if it didn't, then ask us to make another one that does.
Do better. Do better.
Do better. Just prompt us. It's how you write the prompt. So go to ChatGPT and say, these guys are hopeless. Can you help them with some tips? And then send that to us in a comment. Perfect.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, team.
Bye.
Bye.